And yeah, we're here living in extremely divided times, but you know this. And one of the problems that we really have at the moment is massive polarisation. And I belong to an email group, so there's a group of us friends, and for years we've been exchanging ideas. And, you know, we argue about things, anything in the alternative realms, or, you know, what some would like to call the conspiracy realms. But of course, when COVID came along, that really changed many things, because suddenly it seemed to actually matter more. It wasn't just a kind of light bit of banter. You know, what you believed really could determine the outcome of where everything went. Well, that's how it felt. What we found was that some of us kind of didn't believe any of it. They thought the whole thing was a scam. Others, we thought, okay, there's something to this, but, you know, maybe we're not being given the whole truth. And those people that were in the middle got sort of pulled one way and the other. But what really occurred to me from that process was that that's what was happening in the wider world. And what happens now is that if somebody doesn't like what you say, you are no longer just somebody with an unusual or a slightly weird opinion. You are a heretic. And you're branded a heretic. And because we now live in a world where there are sort of creeds fed to us, especially around, you know, the recent events, if you say anything which questions that creed, you are effectively a blasphemer. So you get the polarity going in one direction, where, you know, that direction thinks anybody that questions orthodoxy is a very terrible person. But then you also get the other polarity that thinks, well, I'm not going to be told what to do. I need to have my own thoughts and my own mind, but then you stop trusting anything at all that the mainstream tells you. And of course, the issue with that is still a form of polarisation. So with all these emails going back and forth on this group, I really got a glimpse into the impasse that we were reaching, and nobody was changing their minds. It wasn't making anybody any happier. And what really came across to me in the end was, how do we find a way to disagree with each other without actually splitting? And that, of course, is precisely what's been happening in the wider world. And I didn't want to be told anymore, this is what you must think, either by the mainstream or by the conspiracy world. I wanted to be able to be nuanced about it and say, well, can I actually just consider both sides before I come down on one side or the other? So this built up, and I gradually thought, you know, I really have got to put this into words. So I wrote an article about it, you know, in the middle of the lockdown, the first big lockdown, and I got a lot of feedback from that. But, you know, in the end, I thought, there's more to say here. How can we actually have true freedom of expression without somebody trying to shut you down? So, hence the new Heretics, the book, was born. And it's something that I do feel very strongly about, and obviously I'd love lots of people to read it, but not just because it's a book I've written, it's because I think the issues that it addresses are so crucial. And here we are, right, so we're coming out of the worst of the whole pandemic stuff, but it's left people incredibly divided. And now some people will never trust the mainstream again. But equally, because the alternative thinkers have been so demonised, there are people that are never going to listen to us again. Neither path is a solution. So the book's been written in a way to actually, as the subtitle, Understanding the Conspiracy Theories Polarizing the World, might suggest, it's not trying to sell any theory to anybody, but it's trying to say, this is why people believe this. This is why people question. And the world of the alternative, thanks to, you know, the more extreme end of it, and like QAnon is a good example, where that's now been very publicised, you know, and in a very dark way, and in a way that suggests that anybody that believes that is utterly mad. What the mainstream now cleverly does is, if anybody does question orthodoxy, well, obviously you belong to QAnon. And you go, no, I don't belong to QAnon. I don't necessarily believe with everything, you know, that they believe. But on the other hand, you know, I respect their right to have the opinions that they have. But if you say that, that's not good enough. You are then one of them. And we see this over and over again. And we've seen this with people that question the vaccine. Suddenly, even if you do believe in vaccination, but you're worried about endless boosters and what that could do to the human race, and even the Lancet has expressed some concerns about that, suddenly you are anti-vaxx, as if that, you know, as if that explains everything. And have you noticed now, whenever anything comes up where somebody questions any orthodoxy, they'll very quickly say, oh, and they're anti-vaxx. Or, you know, they were with anti-vaxx demonstrators, as if that's all you need to know, that these people are unreasonable and must never be listened to. But that is so unnuanced. The book is in 3 sections, and it begins with what happened at the US Capitol, because that, again, changed people. Whereas before alternative thinkers were perhaps harmless eccentrics, suddenly they were now potential insurrectionists, and they were seen as very dangerous people. And I really notice the talks that I give, and I give talks to alternative groups, but also very mainstream groups. What I've seen is people's attitudes have shifted. It's like, oh, that's all very dangerous. You mustn't talk about that. Whereas before, they were all quite keen to hear about conspiracies, and they've been trained to believe now that you basically are going to become a revolutionary and start bursting into public buildings now. And, you know, yes, clearly there is a contingent that will do that, and indeed did do that. But here's the problem, that then led to further condemnation of any alternative thinking, and that's when the nuance completely fell out of it. So the first part of the book, it opens with that, and then the arguments over COVID and the, you know, the deep divisions that we've mentioned, that has left as to what people believe. The book is not there to resolve the issues. It's not so much about saying this is right or that is wrong. It's about having a discussion about the discussion, because you can't even seem to do that these days without somebody coming down on you like a ton of bricks. So what I'm trying to do is actually bring people back to the table and say, can we find a way where we can actually put the issues on the table and accept that somebody else is going to have a different viewpoint to you, but actually get down to the brass tacks of what this is about. There is an incredible tendency at the moment, especially in the mainstream media world, to blur boundaries. And we saw a lot of that. I mean, like, did you know the word unprecedented is something that's been very, very overused in these times, where, you know, yes, there were some aspects to the pandemic that were unprecedented, but now they use it appended to literally anything. And what it does is it detaches you from sort of any continuity. So they say, well, that's unprecedented, so this is all new, and we, the authorities, are going to do exactly what we need to do, because it's all so unprecedented. And I began to find that that was being used as a way of actually not taking responsibility, just by saying, well, that's unprecedented, so therefore we can justify any policy we want. It began to feel a little bit uncomfortable. So there's discussion there about how the boundaries blur, and if, therefore, somebody does question any orthodoxy within what you might want to call reasonable boundaries, suddenly you're pushed further out and out, where actually you're seen as unreasonable. And where are the reasonable boundaries? Who decides where the reasonable boundaries of discussion are? And that blurring of those boundaries is something that I think has become a real problem. And so, you know, the first part of the book looks at that. And it looks at just how we are continually stimulated into polarity. Right? The world relies on us being polarized. I mean, just look at the world of advertising. It needs your instant attention. It needs a reaction. You open a newspaper. Those headlines are designed to make you react, and usually with anger or with some kind of polarized reaction. The last thing they want is a nuanced middle ground reaction where you actually think about all sides, because that doesn't sell papers. It doesn't get your attention, doesn't make you go for the click stuff. Normally you click on it and it's nothing of the kind of what they suggested, but it's a way of getting you to react. So we've all been built up to react, and yet interestingly now we've come to a time whereby, you know, those who think in an alternative way are now actually having their say, and you've got truckers blocking roads in Canada and whatever. Suddenly they're saying, how dare they react like that? Even though people have been built up to this over the years. But it's double-edged, because the other problem that we have is that so alternative conversation has been notably suppressed in the last 2 years, to the degree where now, censorship is unapologetic. And you've only got to look at the videos being taken off of YouTube, openly declared policies of removing conspiracy material. People are deplatformed, they're taken away from having a voice, and so on. And yet, there seems to be a feeling that the mainstream therefore thinks they've dealt with that opinion. So by suppressing it and removed it from public view, it's gone. Hasn't gone. All they've done is actually guarantee a more hardcore response. And it generates extremism, the very extremism they say they don't want. They are guaranteeing it by constantly pushing a lid down on it and saying you must not be heard. And in the end, people do wind up having to stand on streets with a loud hailer, because there's no other way you can get your voice out there. It's counterproductive and it's foolish. So the New Heretics looks at this. So the first part of the book is about, the wider background to where we've been led to. And then the second part of the book actually dares to look at some of the very issues we're told that we must not talk about. And again, it's not about saying who's right or wrong, but it's saying, can we at least understand why people have these beliefs? So we look, for instance, at those that believe that EMF devices, yes, phones and computers and broadband might not be very good for us in the long run. We all use it, it's lovely and convenient, isn't it? But there are many scientists that do think it has a wider effect, which may well not be good for our health in the long run. Now that's massively suppressed in the mainstream media, because there's so much money attached to it. Nobody wants to question this kind of technology, and governments are in cahoots with the companies doing it. Nobody wants to hear this undermined. But you look at the amount of actually mainstream scientists who really do have concerns, and you think, well, hang on a minute, shouldn't they at least be heard? And what happens is that the minute they step out of mainstream science to express a view on that, they're branded or rebranded mavericks. So suddenly they're not scientists anymore, even though they were last week. They're now mavericks, and you mustn't listen to them. And their peer group excludes them. And so suddenly they are pushed out to the conspiracy fringes, even though they're just as scientific in their thinking as anybody else. Now again, you could argue that doesn't mean they're right, but shouldn't they be heard? And like if you take 5G, and that chapter goes on to discuss, the concerns over the 5G phenomenon. Is it a known fact that it harms us? No. But then you look at the amount of scientists who've said it could do, and we really need to look into this. There was a big consortium of scientists that called for a moratorium on 5G before they started to bring it in, and they were ignored. And these are not mavericks. They're perfectly sensible scientists who said, we're not sure this is a good way to go. But no, so it all went ahead and is now unfolding all around us. Does that mean 5G causes COVID symptoms? Well, that's another big argument. And in my personal view, I haven't yet seen absolute evidence of that. But it's not fair to somebody to say you shouldn't be concerned about that. Because maybe 5G, if some of these scientists are right, it could reduce, your resistance to certain issues around you. If your health is declining because of 5G, maybe you might be more susceptible to COVID. There might be more of an interlinking pattern here than we know. But you're told no. If you question 5G, you're a madman or a terrible, evil QAnon conspiracy theorist. So they always get that in. And you must be anti-vaxx. Well, we come in the end to the book to the whole vax thing. Because I am getting rather tired of being told that you must not discuss it. I am not medically qualified. I have no medical qualifications whatsoever. Therefore, that seems to me that I should have the right to listen to all sides. Because I'm not sure. I don't have the qualifications to say for certain that that is true or that is not true. But therefore, I just want to hear all sides and I'll make up my own mind. But that's not the way it's worked, is it? So now we have a long history of why people question vaccination that we're not allowed to talk about. So the book, without any judgment, just looks at the history of doubt in it. And it goes way back before COVID, of course. Particularly, I think the New Age movement was very concerned about science injecting things into you, and they believed that more natural ways of protecting yourself were more appropriate. And that's their view. You might think they're utterly wrong. That's fine. But from that begins to, you have a creeping doubt. And so suddenly, when we're faced with so many people in the world being basically told you must be vaccinated, or if you don't, you're a really awful person and you're spreading the virus to everybody else, even though we now know it doesn't really work like that. What they've managed to do is so demonize anybody that questions any aspect of medical science now, you can no longer have a conversation. But therefore, the mainstream does not understand why some people insist on questioning it, and why they don't want endless boosters, why they are worried that it might be doing something to us that we don't understand. You do not have to agree with these people. If you are for 100% for all the normal medical science, great. However, just to say to somebody, but you must never express that doubt, ever, A, it doesn't work, as we've already said, it doesn't make it go away. And B, what it does is it removes from public view what the original arguments were. So the public cannot understand why people would ever dare to question vaccination. And these people just come across as the maddest, craziest people ever. So the book looks at, look, these are the arguments. Not to say what the truth is, because I don't know what the truth is, because I don't have the qualifications to understand it. And even people in the medical profession say immunology is one of the hardest subjects to really get to grips with. But we discuss it in the book. And I think this is very important, because now the current trait is to remove it so that you don't discuss it. But you will never get anywhere like that. We need to understand why there are doubts and where that comes from. And the book goes on to look at then other aspects. Climate change, the grand debate about that. Well, many would say there is no debate about it. Obviously it's real. That still doesn't change the minds of those that question. Fracking. You know, if you believe the mainstream media, fracking was the most wonderful thing ever in the world. Well, it's been suspended so far here in this country, but that might not be forever, especially if the Ukraine situation kicks off and we suddenly decide we do need gas or whatever. Don't be surprised if that comes back. But nonetheless, you know, anybody that questioned that was demonized in the press. Fluoridation and all these things. And again, I don't have the answers. But I do see arguments that I feel should be heard out. So the book is trying to say, can we understand why people question, where that is coming from? Don't get so polarized that because somebody has said something that horrifies you as an opinion, that you demonize them. You say, yeah, you're a terrible person and you should be basically banned from ever speaking. That's just not a solution. So, I mean, the book goes into all this kind of thing and then brings us to that whole notion of, can you have a debate these days? There's a lot of concern about, you know, woke thinking. And not all woke thinking is bad. Again, you know, you've got an alternative view. That's all terrible mind control. There are some reasons why people have gone down that path. And there are social history reasons why people now find opinions which might oppose theirs difficult to deal with. Rather than condemning the so-called snowflakes, shouldn't we understand where that comes from? If there is such a thing as a snowflake generation, we need to get to the bottom of what that's about. So there's an exploration of that and why some people find it really hard to debate. And now, yeah, I think we are in a very dangerous time when you're not really allowed to have a debate, not in the mainstream. We need to change that, because if you don't, as we've already established, you will just generate more people in trucks blocking cities, more people with loud hailers. There's going to be trouble on the streets, and we're seeing that. And it's because they've not been allowed to express these ideas, whether they're right or wrong, in a reasonable way. In a reasonable forum. And so, you know, what's happening is with cancel culture, you know, that's the classic, that phrase says it all. You're just cancelled if you say the wrong thing, but that can't go on forever. And we can only hope that we're on a wheel there where we come back to some kind of nuance. From that point on, you know, in the last part of it, again, a wider background. The digital age has changed everything. The technology we have to share information, the way our minds work, the way young people are now constantly stimulated by digital technology. This is new. This is new and a revolution. Did we expect that suddenly we were all going to adapt so quickly? Well, we haven't adapted. It's not wrong necessarily, but we're going through it and we need to understand the changes that that makes. So we look at that and where technology is going to take us and the risks of transhumanism, where there's no question we are going to at some point wind up half robot, half human. and there might be many benefits to that, but there's also many issues around that, because they're already actively, and Elon Musk and that, talking about having brain chips. The danger of that is that you will wind up, therefore, having some kind of centralized knowledge. And we already know, just from people that only believe Wikipedia, that it only gives you one version, and it's the orthodox version. And they're trying by the day to remove the alternative version so that nobody can see that or hear that. Well, that will be extremely serious when actually all the information and knowledge you have is coming into that chip there. Who determines what it is that we should hear? But it's like they're just desperate that those that question are pushed to the far fringes where nobody will ever find them again. And the hope seems to be the future generations won't even want to hear that. Conspiracy theory, oh, that was a very terrible thing, wasn't it, of the 21st century? I mean, it isn't, it goes back centuries. But that, I think, is partly the thinking. That's what they want. So we look at a lot of things in the book, but eventually you've got to come up with some solutions. I put forward an idea of quantum thinking. If we're also polarized, which we very definitely are, there are ways of coming out of that polarization. One, and it's something that I've tried to practice for a few years now, is before you decide what you believe about something, hold that idea in your head from over there first, then hold that idea over there in your head. Switch it about. How does it feel to believe that or that? Can you believe both? Is there yet another third way? It's a really fascinating thing to do because the brain resists. It doesn't like it. It likes what it knows, what you think you know. It's really worth practicing. It's what I call a quantum approach. Being able to sort of process things somewhere in the middle. It's not either or. It's not a 1 or a 0. There is something else you can go to. And I would recommend trying this. Doesn't mean you never have an opinion. And I go out of the way in the book to say this. That's not what it's saying. But what it is saying is that before you reach what you believe, just understand how it feels to believe something else. And it's not something we're very good at doing. And the book puts forward ways of doing this. It also tries to find new ways to define truth. Truth panels, sooner or later, we're going to have to sit down and actually work out what actually did happen. I mean, take, say, 9/11. So many arguments about that. So many conspiracy theories. And yeah, it's absolutely obvious we've not been told the whole truth. One day, somebody's going to have to sit down and define, literally, minute by minute, what did happen? Was there an explosion? Yes or no? Fine. What caused that explosion? Could it be this? Could it be that? And you allow everybody to put everything on the table and you whittle it down, and in the end you will come up with probabilities. Now that doesn't mean you will know 100% what happened, but you'll get closer than the polarization. And at the end of the day, and this is something that I discuss, we all choose our truths. That's the uncomfortable truth, and I really realised that with the whole COVID thing. We choose our truths. You can never know 100% the truth of something. You base it on probabilities, and that will of course be affected by your own personal experience and where you come from and the way you think. But be aware that we all do that. Everybody in the alternative world, in the mainstream world, we choose truths, and you just have to hope you're right. But given that we are choosing it, getting dogmatic about it, attacking somebody over there because they have a different viewpoint to us is not the way forward. And the book wraps up basically with looking at where we are now, right? We're in a very dangerous place at the moment, I think, where I think we are truly in danger of losing the ability to debate. And the suppression, the censorship is now, I think, so extreme that either they're going to generate the kickback responses that we're seeing, or they really do hope that one day those that do question will just fall silent and we'll never hear from them. But is that good for human evolution? Because if you just say that idea was shelved and locked in a box over there, you might not learn from what you might have learned from had you brought that out and put it on the table. So the new heretics, they're all around us. We are all heretics if we question anything. But it really now has become the new blasphemy. And we're surrounded by creeds. And that's all well and good, and maybe sometimes they're right. But the day you say you must not question, you cannot question, you're on a very bad road. So what the new heretics is trying to do is to put all this on the table and try to put the polarization aside and actually say, let's debate this. Let's look at the reasons why people believe what they believe, why they feel what they feel. And it's a message to both sides. If you go to war, you wind up as a soldier. So we're in a war at the moment for truth. We're in a war for, you know, is the alternative true? Is the mainstream true? And the danger of that is you're getting into a mindset of being a soldier and you lose your humanity. And I've seen this happen with a few people that are really pushing against, you know, the orthodoxy. And I admire them very much for doing that. But they can also lose that compassionate side. You have to fight for what you believe in with compassion for why somebody else might disagree with you. That's something that's so hard to do. And the book encourages that. It's like, okay, be the soldier, do what you've got to do. There's a long list of things we can do. Campaigning, writing, getting out there, right, doing what you can to put your view forward. But at the end of the day, if you stop being human to do that, that is just yet another cul-de-sac. So we need to just come back in the middle and remember our humanity and try and be open to so many different ideas that are out there before we decide what our most probable truth is. And at the end of the day, it says go and get a cup of tea before you go any further and just sit down and be still, because that's something also in the world of social media we don't do we? A new exciting post comes through, oh my God, I'm going to forward that on, but you haven't necessarily thought about it. We need to learn to sit with things and just, you know, yeah, have that human side to it before we condemn that person there or, you know, forward that on without thinking what impact that could have to somebody. So we need to be free thinking. The future of free expression is something we all need to be thinking about, and now's the time to think about it. Not, by the way, in 25 years, because if those that do care about having debates about things don't speak up now and do what, you know, it needs to be done to keep the debates alive, I do worry about where we'll be in 25 years. So the new Heretics is also, it's a plea that we actually do need, finally, to actually sit down and say, no, this ability to debate and hear everybody out, whether they are right or wrong, must be preserved. So if you're looking for something that will hopefully stimulate you, and, you know, I've just rushed through there, but, you know, really get to the depths of what this is all about and why this matters so much at the moment, the new Heretics will be a very good starting point. I was very encouraged to see it appeared in Amazon's top 20 civil rights list a couple of weeks ago, because I don't want it just to be sort of put in the ghetto of conspiracy theory. Yes, it addresses that, of course it does, but the principles that it's concerned with are much, much wider than that. And I'm glad to see at the moment, so far, it seems to be reaching other people. Because we can't just preach to the choir. We've got to, you know, get these ideas out there and just get everybody back chatting and being human and talking and accepting that we will never all agree with each other. That is all right. We don't have to go to war if that's the case. So thank you for listening to that. And I believe now we get to do a bit of Q&A. Yeah. So if anybody has anything they'd like to share, please do.
One thing struck me when you were talking about, and I don't really disagree with what you're saying, with the idea of looking at that opinion, etc. But research has found that if you tend to give people, you can have this choice, that choice, that choice, that choice, that choice, and that choice, they end up finding it difficult to choose anything at all. They just got confused. And I think one of the issues at the end of the day, and I think this is why some people do get frustrated with conspiracy theorists, is because it's a bit like that. It could be this, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. Because at the end of the day, sometimes, like with, say, vaccinations, you have to make a choice. And you have to, you know, and you have to do something. And I think sometimes, I remember listening to someone who was anti-vaxx, and he was very intelligent, and he could give lots of reasons and lots of research, etc., etc. But what he couldn't do, really, is make a choice, because he knew too much. And do you think there is a danger? The other thing that came to mind, actually, when you talked about we live in this sort of age, the thing that came to mind is like the Spanish Inquisition. We've lived through ages where you couldn't have an alternate view, that you would be regarded as a heretic if you didn't agree with mainstream, in this case, Catholicism. And I think what's changed is mass media, because we become more aware of alternate viewpoints. And the fact, like you've got a bookshop like this, demonstrates that we can go in, and if we want to know more about, you know, witchcraft, mysticism, whatever, we can do so. So, but what's changed really is I think, is mass media is making us more aware of perhaps a lone voice possibly, which wasn't there before. You didn't have if you were a lone voice, you didn't have the opportunity.
Yes, I think the opportunity. Yes, I mean the lone voices were there, no doubt. Yeah. I mean, that's a very good point. There's a subtle distinction though, and discussing the quantum approach, as I call it. I mean, I'm not saying that's a scientific term. It's not so much about understanding each different idea, because yes, there are so many. You go mad. It's about feeling your way into why people feel the way they do about them. It's as much that, it's getting back to that human compassion thing for why somebody might feel differently to you. If you can feel that, you can see it back the other way. So that it's more about that rather than ever thinking you're going to come to, you know, an absolute decision by doing that. Because most of us know in our hearts what we're going to be led to. But what I'm saying is, before you just default to what your normal default of belief is, it's just worth just putting your mind over there, thinking, what would this feel like if I didn't believe that? So it's more about that. And it's really fascinating, because I've found when I started to do that, there's a real resistance. No, I think this. But just to step outside of that, it's valuable. In terms of what you're saying, in terms of sooner or later you have to make a decision, well, of course, that is in contention. I mean, just take the vaccines. Yes, there are many people, very likely, from what we see in the mainstream, the majority, that think we should go with what consensus says, with what consensus science says. But of course, that's the whole argument, because people are saying, no, this is so serious, if I don't want that, am I not allowed to object? And I don't have an easy answer to that, but that, of course, is absolutely where we're now at, where it's like, but should a consensus, which is just one side of what the mainstream media says, should that take precedence? And, you know, we have fact checkers and all that, but then you look at the people running the fact checking societies or whatever, and they're CIA directors and speech writers for Condoleezza Rice and so on. So some say, well, no, that is not a fair selection of humanity. And that's why the truth panel's idea that I put forward in the book would have to include everybody. Otherwise, you would never get any kind of agreement. Yes,
I mean, talking about the vaccine, there is a bit of a problem, because two of the world's top experts are saying the vaccines might be dangerous. You've got Dr. Mark Yeadon, who's the former vice president of Pfizer, so one of the world's top experts on vaccines, and Dr. Robert Malone is an American who's the inventor of the mRNA vaccine. They are saying the vaccines could, and if you look at Michael Yeadon's video, it's very scary. He says that it could damage lots, but he says most vaccines take about 10 years to sort of, but these have been very quick, and he says, and he's questioning whether, he even says, could they actually be a depopulation? And he's the former vice president of Pfizer. He's not a crackpot, so they're the two of the world's top.
No, I mean, I don't want to get into this debate here, and the book does discuss that, and of course, is the vaccine depopulation thing. What I would say is this, I mean, of course, there are those that do question his credentials. And I'm not questioning it, I don't know enough about the guy, but there are people who say he's not qualified to be saying what he's saying. And that's the problem, because the minute somebody says that, and they say, well, I worked for whatever, Pfizer for all these years, the assumption is they must know what they're talking about. But then other people say, no, they don't, because he only did this, and he only did that, and he doesn't know about that. And again, you're left to choose your truth in the middle. However, I do believe if that is his viewpoint, he should be allowed to express it and not be censored. And those that are questioning are, of course, now being censored. That's the problem. But equally, I totally understand why the mainstream medical establishment is horrified by that, because they probably genuinely believe it's very good for us to all be vaccinated and we'll all be super healthy and the world will be a better place. You can't just demonise them to think they're all trying to depopulate the earth. And that is, again, a polarity of view which I don't go down with. I think most people in that world truly think it's the right way forward. If there is some wider horrific conspiracy plot, even then I don't think that would involve everybody. There's plainly a lot of people there thinking they're doing right for human health, so we always need to bear that in mind as well. Yes?
It doesn't involve everybody, but the few who control the money dictate the rest. So according to BBC World Service, over 130,000 documentaries were taken off YouTube, which were anti-vaxx. So a few people control the social media. And as Lenin said, if you repeat a lie long enough, people start believing it. But it's a kind of hypnosis.
This is the problem. This is the problem.
Fight. And they actually want people to be angry and go and shout and say, look, we told you, they're nutters, you know. They actually want that kind of reaction to justify their dictatorship.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right, and that's the problem. And of course, when you do that, when you take down all these things that do question, all you're doing is convincing those people that they must be right. Because if they're trying to censor somebody, well, surely they must be right to do. You know, that's the problem. It just reinforces them. Nobody comes back to them and says, okay, well, let's debate this. Like, did you notice with the NHS workers? So many did not wish to be vaccinated. That was very interesting. When, say, the BBC interviewed them, some of them would come up in the course of the interview with why they had doubts, but the interviewers would never talk about it. They wouldn't pick up the thread. They wouldn't say, well, why exactly are you concerned? It was all peripheral, and they were very careful not to engage with the debate. And that's a problem, because if you don't engage with the debate and really get to the hard core of why people do question it, people don't understand. So people on the outside are going, how can NHS people not want the vaccine? They can't comprehend it, because the mainstream media won't give them the reasons why they believe that. And I thought that was really noticeable. And again, I just want to make the point here. I am not pro or anti-vaccination. I am absolutely pro-choice. I think people must do what they feel is right for them. And maybe it is a very good thing and it helps people. But to enforce medication on an entire population, as places like Austria are now beginning to do, I feel deeply uncomfortable. Then you are on the road to a dystopia, I do believe. So that's the problem. But yes, and the more they censor those that do question, I think the more you're just going to create further resistance.
Adolf Ringon. Adolf Ringon.
Right, well, yes. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share? Yes.
And maybe the word choice needs to be preluded with informed.
Informed choice, yes.
Because if we hadn't got that open debate, which is what you're alluding to, I must praise you for the timing of this. I don't think the timing could be better.
Yeah.
And I was saying to Helen just now, I'm finding that in a lot of circles that people are really, people that are open-minded are really wanting and craving this intelligent, non-violent debate.
Yes.
And you can't be informed if you've got interviewers that are doing what they're saying.
That is why...
And you can't be informed if you're shouting people down and calling them a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
No. That is why I've written the book, because I feel if somebody doesn't say this now, and I haven't yet seen anybody else from a mainstream publisher putting this out there, so well done Watkins for doing this, because they're allowing a conversation. It's not anti-vax, it's not pro-conspiracy, but it's about, hey, hang on a minute, can we just talk about this? And I would add something there, that it's about informed choice, but equally, for those that decide not to take the vaccine, they should be making informed choices there, because there's an equal amount that just immediately resist it and don't look into it. I would say everybody should get as informed about both sides as they can before they make their choice, because otherwise you're falling into exactly the same pattern that people accuse the mainstream of doing. Yes, go on.
Hi. Would you say that we're moving into a time when one is either pro-choice, like you and me, or anti-choice, like the governments of Austria and Australia and Canada, for example?
It's moving ever more in that direction, isn't it? What I find curious about the West at the moment is that we're all pointing the finger at China and Russia and for being very authoritarian, and yet we're basically moving in the same direction. We're doing it sort of covertly, well, and yet not. But whereas they're sort of very condemning of those, and yet I see us on the same trajectory.
Russia hasn't introduced mandatory vaccines.
No, I'm not generally, not just in the vaccine debate, but so are we moving at the moment towards more of an authoritarian way? Yes, I think that we are. I don't think that's terribly good. Does anyone? And yet clearly lots of people around the world seem perfectly happy with authoritarianism because they don't have to think for themselves. They do you know, what they're told to do, and it's easy. And I think that's the danger, is that everybody is looking for an easy life. And with what we've seen with COVID creed, a lot of people went with it because it was easier than being informed. It's like, right now, I'm just going to do what I'm told, because then you haven't got to go out there. But equally, I saw that in the conspiracy world, it's easier just to deny that it's happening. It's easier to condemn the vaccine rather than actually spend any time really looking at it. And that, to me, is not helpful either. And the book addresses both sides of that argument. For heaven's sake, know why you are choosing this truth. Know what the basis for that is, rather than just go blindly with your old instincts. And then, if you say, yes, I feel strongly about this, great, fantastic, that's your choice. But know why. And I have found there are some people that don't really know why. And they're just going with just the way they are. And that's okay, but that enables people on the outside to attack and say, you don't know your stuff. And the minute they see that, of course, then the arguments are undermined for a lot of people. And that's not healthy in the stand that we are taking. And then we can go out there and fight that stand. If you don't know, you're going to be shot down very, very quickly. And that's the danger.
Last question, perhaps?
Oh.
I have a genuine question for you. I haven't read your book, obviously. I'm just discovering it this evening. But I wonder whether you made any attempt, deliberately or not deliberately, or inadvertently by omission, to deal with the biggest conspiracy of all, which is the New World Order agenda, which has been going on for 200 and nearly 60 years next decade, and which obviously is something that people can study, they can verify what's being said publicly and officially about this agenda. So the new global political agenda.
The New World Order is more than referenced. Yes. Yes.
More than referenced.
More than reference.
Yes,
Okay,
it's
right.
very present in the book. And also, of course, in my previous book, Conspiracies, I've written about it at length as well. Yeah, but listen, the New World Order exists. It isn't a conspiracy theory. You can trace it, as you say. You can see how it developed. Whether it's responsible for all the horrors everybody says it is, that's another debate. But it absolutely does exist. It is an agenda. And again, we should be aware of it. And it's not fair for those on the outside to say that you are wrong to talk about the New World Order. What is, I think, very difficult is that, so they're clearly up to no good very often. They have their own agendas. This is fully discussed in the book. They use their own fake news. This is just visible. It's obvious. And yet, in a time of crisis like COVID, suddenly they expect us to trust them and trust every word they say. And funnily enough, people don't. So they've created this themselves, whatever the ultimate truth. And even if now they really think they're doing the right thing for humanity, to condemn people for questioning them, I'm sorry, but yeah, they've put themselves into this hole, I'm afraid. But that's why only nuance and a lot of balanced discussion and allowing people to put all this on the table is going to take us forward. The current trajectory they're on of suppression simply does not work, and I believe will not work in the long run. And if they want an easier time of it, yeah, we have to be able to discuss very openly.
They're making $97 million a day from the vaccine. $97 million a day. More than the oil companies.
Yes, there's a lot of money behind it as well, of course. Listen, we have to end here. I'm going to go upstairs, and if anybody wants to have their book signed, I'll be happy to do that. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate that. And look, I hope that it was a bit of food for thought for you, and go out there and do what you can.
Big round of
Thank you very much.